Hi, everyone. Welcome to The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Daily Beast correspondent-at-large Barbie Lazza-Nadeau is with us from the Italian capital, Rome. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Welcome to the show. Welcome as well to Dave Clark, who is slaving away at the desk for the French news agency AFP in Brussels. How are you, sir?
I'm good. Sorry I couldn't be with you in Paris.
Hey, you're not at the office, are you? You're at home as well.
I have a very studious home.
Okay, very
studious. We're working hard. We are working hard today, but the office is half and half. Half at the office, half at home.
I see there's books behind you, but there's no books behind Johanna Frönden, Paris correspondent for Aftonbladet, the Swedish newspaper, who is in Barcelona. What's going on?
Football's picking up slowly, and lots of criticism towards the government in Spain, of course, because of how they've handled the COVID outbreak. So I'm in between the two.
We'll talk about it in a bit. And many thanks for joining us from the Catalan capital and from Istanbul, Borzu Dargahi, international correspondent for a British daily newspaper, The Independent. How are you?
Pretty good. Great to see you.
Great to see you. It's been
home in the background there. Very elegant.
It's a new world.
Like gym shorts and flip flops underneath your suit.
All right, we'll discuss that after the show. The big story of the week, of course, is how the Black Lives Matter movement has morphed worldwide, and what we've seen since last weekend is statues start to tumble. In Bristol, it was quite spectacular to see those images of people at a protest rally last weekend take down the statue of a 17th century slave trader by the name of Edward Colston. Colston's statue was then fished out of the harbor. The mayor says it's going to sit instead at a local museum so that the history of what he stood for can be discussed. And we saw similar scenes in places like Oxford, where a statue of Cecil Rhodes has already been the subject of contention for a long time. Borzu, when you look at this movement to take down statues, what's your reaction?
And it's about this kind of global moment of, I hate to use the term, but like consciousness raising and an awareness about race and power relations. In a similar way to the way the Me Too movement kind of reverberated across the world about gender relations and disparity in power in terms of men and women. This is a phenomenon that's sending shockwaves across the world, raising a global discussion about the treatment of minority populations all over the world. And I think it's an interesting moment. And the desire to take control of public space, which is what we're talking about when people are toppling statues. It's not really about history. It's not about erasing history. It's about reshaping public space and the public forum, so to speak. That's what is really taking place, in my opinion.
Yeah, reclaiming public space, you say, but there are those who wonder if it is erasing history. Case in point, we saw a statue of King Leopold, the 19th century king of the Belgians, who had the whole of the Congo as his personal fiefdom, taken down in the city of Antwerp. That has sparked a conversation in Belgium. It's also sparked a conversation in Kinshasa.
C'est pas une bonne idée, parce que il faut tenir compte de l'histoire. Parce qu'il y a encore des petits enfants qui auront vraiment besoin de cette histoire-là.
Your reaction to that, Dave Clark?
Well, actually, another Leopold statue came down just last night in Oudegem, in a suburb of Brussels. There's been a few either daubed with paint or brought down in the past few days. And in part, this is a kind of intersection between the global moment that Borzu was talking about, obviously most recently inspired by the protests in the United States, and a long-standing discussion here in Belgium about the colonial past. So obviously, the lady you just spoke to in Kinshasa reflects the view of some people here in Belgium as well, where people think this is a it's a mistake to erase history. But remember that most of these statues were put up after Leopold II's reign, and the political purpose of them was about creating a united idea of Belgium when Belgium as a country was at risk within Europe. And the Belgium's particular history in the Congo has always been controversial here, and particularly with young people of African descent, who's obviously a British guy speaking to a French television channel has got to be careful not to imply that Belgium is particularly worse than other European empires. But Leopold was very personally connected with what happened in the Congo, because obviously that was his private domain. It wasn't sort of like the British Africa Company or the French République. He himself is very much a symbol for a lot of the protesters here of the crimes of Belgian colonialism.
And that is all coming to a head, again, sparked by the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Over in the United States, there have been statues not just of Confederate generals who've been targeted, but also, you could say, the founding father of American colonialism, Christopher Columbus. Statues either decapitated, like in Boston, or defaced, like in Miami. Barbie Lazzanado, sitting in Italy. What are the thoughts on that?
Well, I grew up in the United States, obviously, and I grew up very near Minneapolis. It's a town I lived in for very many years. And, watching it from afar in a country like Italy that's had its own issues with racism, we've seen it especially in the realm of soccer, football here. It's really interesting to watch how everybody's pointing their finger, it seems, at the United States without, certainly in Italy, looking at what's happening in their own country. And hopefully this global movement will cause a lot of countries to look a little bit deeper about their own practices. It's not just an American problem. And
taking down a statue of Christopher Columbus?
Yeah, I was listening to Andrew Cuomo, who was saying, well, this really is the, and a symbol of Italian history in the United States. I don't know that the Italians particularly are offended that the statue of Christopher Columbus is taken down across the United States. It hasn't really made the headlines here, but it's curious. It's a really curious thing to see how people are reacting to this and how they're owning this moment and how they're living it. And I think that when the history is written on this particular moment and this racial tension across the globe, it's going to be really interesting to see the process that we're going through right now. I think it's too soon really to analyze.
Johanna Frenton, Sweden doesn't have many former colonies, but it has also minorities and has had racism issues in the past. So what's the view on these statues?
Well, I tell you what, it's very polarized in Sweden. The Black Lives Matters manifestations and gatherings in the last week or two have been quite massive in Sweden, especially in the big towns. And also, the protests against police violence. Now, there's people saying that we've imported the whole debate from the United States. We do have, obviously, a racist problem in Sweden as any other Western country in the world, but maybe it's not so much connected to the Swedish police that is known to be quite, how do I put it? They have a lot less violent, privilege than the ones in the States, for example. We obviously don't have the same weapon laws either. So there are two debates in this. Very clearly, lots of second and third generation immigrants in Sweden feel, the need to protest, and you can really see that by the big gatherings. But also, obviously, lots of what I would call ethnic Swedes of my generation and a little bit younger who feel that there is, racism is a big issue in Sweden as well, and this gives them an excuse or an opportunity to let that be known. Although, the actual happenings in the United States do not have that much to do with the situation with the police, perhaps, in Sweden.
Right. Treatment of minorities is the one issue that's come out of this. The other one, Borzo Daragahi, is police brutality. And that has been an issue that's resonated pretty much all around the world. And I
don't know when governments will learn. You had the spring that in Tunisia that was sparked by police brutality and abuse of power. You had the Egyptian uprising of 2011 that was literally on Police Day. It started on January 25th. You've had police brutality being a spark for so much, and yet, government after government, less and less in the EU, which has seen a decline in the membership and numbers of police forces throughout the EU over the last decade or so. But all around the world, more and more governments are devoting more and more resources to policing, more and more resources to purchasing tear gas and riot equipment. We have a story this week with an Amnesty International report about the increasing use of tear gas all over the world. And this is a big issue. And if this system, if this economy, if this world global order can only be held together by these brutal police tactics, maybe it's not worth salvaging.
And this question of defund the police, Borzu, that we've seen in the United States. We saw, for instance, outside the state capitol in the state of Washington in Seattle, there's been what they call a Seattle Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, and yet there's a lot of people with guns and there's a lot of dangerous people, and you need someone to walk the streets. Case in point, we saw those statistics come out from Chicago, where over Memorial Day weekend at the end of last month, there was the highest number of homicides in decades.
I mean, that is a terrible tragedy that seems to happen whenever there's a holiday weekend in the city of Chicago, which is where I grew up. And it's been a kind of recurrent phenomenon having to do with another big issue in the United States, the prevalence and availability of guns. So you have these turf wars over drugs all over the world. In Italy, you have these turf wars over drug dealing. In Istanbul, there's turf wars over drug dealing. But because of the prevalence of weapons of war in the United States, these fights between neighborhood gangs take on, the element of like militia battles and gun wars. And that's probably why you see so much gunfighting in those kind of parts of the country. And by the way, Chicago Police Department is one of the most brutal and overfunded and over-militarized police forces in the world, probably, definitely in the United States. And yet they're not able to be effective against this problem, against this. So what's the point? They're spending all this money in all of these North American cities, United States cities, and yet they're not able to really be effective. So I think defund the police, as overstated as it may be, what it really signals is a desire to restructure and reformat law enforcement in general.
All right, and the lesson perhaps learned here in France this week was if you're going to do police reform, you have to tread very carefully. The Interior Minister coming out on Monday and announcing there'd be a ban on police chokeholds, saying he personally favored using tasers more. Well, reaction was swift.
On est ici présent, menottes au sol, parce qu'on s'est fait insulter.
Dave Clark, your reaction?
Well, the French police don't have the greatest reputation for being gentle in the world. And we saw during the Gilets jaunes protest that quite a lot of people lost their eyes, shot out by flashball guns. And it's been striking to me, being here in Europe during...
French police will counter that, Dave, and say they had contradictory orders during the Yellow Vests movement. They were overworked, understaffed. They say that they were politicized against their will. That's their claim.
Okay. I've covered protests in many parts of the world, and I don't find the French police to approach these things in a very gentle way personally. And a lot of anti-racist campaigners and would say that they've been treated quite roughly in demonstrations in Paris in recent years.
Johanna Frinton, your thoughts?
I have to say that I've been living I usually live in Paris, and in the last 10 years, I've been shocked a few times on how many people, especially, young people of color in Paris or around Paris, who just seem to maybe not accept, but there is such a an idea of the police being brutal and racist and not helpful in the banlieue, in any troubled suburb. And I do also agree with the fact that there have been lots and lots of incidents, but only the fact that there is a whole generation and a big group of people in France who do not feel safe around the police, who do not call the police, in fact, when they need help or crime has been committed against them, tells you something about the gravity in this situation and the very complicated issue ahead of the French police to sort of regain, the trust of lots of French people, if that's what they want. I can also see the problem, obviously, for the government and interior minister wanting to address the issue, but also balancing, between insulting the police and having a dialogue with their syndicate, their trade union. It's a complicated issue, but it was in fact established last week by le défenseur des droits, that French police in Paris in a certain arrondissement had in fact systematically discriminated against minorities in a couple of years that they had investigated. This is the first time ever that in French a French authority or in French administration it's agreed, or it's been addressed as a real issue. And in fact, this tells you something about the situation and the gravity of it. It's very, very complicated. I also agree with what you said before. The French police, especially in Paris, has been tested a lot with the Yellow Vest movement, for example. Lots of them are exhausted. Not far from all of them are racist. We have to remember that. But there is, in fact, a long history of controlling, ID controlling, especially young children of immigrants or, minorities in France. That certainly has been systematized in France for a long, long time.
Barbie Latza-Nadeau, this Friday morning, the leader of the far-right National Front, Marine Le Pen, went and visited a police station in one of those troubled banlieues that Johanna was talking about, those working-class suburbs of Paris. There's a sense that the jury is still out on whether or not we will get police reform.
That's right. I mean, I think police reform across Europe needs to be probably discussed on a broader level, where, we look at the police reform in Italy, for example. One of the biggest problems here is not police brutality, but corruption and organized crime and things like that. So when you look across the European Union, you're looking at all sorts of different ways to reform all sorts of different arms of the police. It's not really going to be something you can have a blanket reform with. Here in Italy, police reform is so far down on the agenda that I don't think that it's a priority by any means in this country.
All right, we're halfway through the show, and for the first time in a long while, it's only at this point where we're going to say the word coronavirus. It's been, again, another one of these weeks where you feel like the whole world is in flux. The big story out of Africa was the first death of a head of state from coronavirus, Pierre Nkurunziza. He had downplayed it completely, continuing to play football. He died suddenly at the age of 55. He's suspected to have had it, and so is his wife. There is here in Europe, again, this competing narratives over coronavirus, how bad the outbreak has been. Barbie Latza-Nadeau's in Italy, we saw what could be a foreshadow of what could come here to France, and that is to say class action lawsuits against the government over their handling of lockdown and over whether or not more deaths could have been prevented. This came in a case filed in Bergamo.
Per cui per una serie di vicende medico-sanitarie poi è arrivato all'ospedalizzazione e da lì non l'abbiamo più visto. Abbiamo ricevuto solo un'urna.
Vogliamo giustizia e più che altro anche sapere la verità. e la verità va di pari passo con la giustizia. Purtroppo nessuna somma in denaro potrà ridarci mamma e papà e l'affetto dei nostri cari.
Barbie Latsanado, again, with this lawsuit, do they have a strong case?
Well, it's interesting because Giuseppe Conti spent the better part of Friday morning talking to the prosecutor from Bergamo about this particular lawsuit. Now, he's not exactly under investigation, but they're trying to figure out what went wrong and when it went wrong. And in Lombardy, which is still the epicenter of the coronavirus crisis here in Italy, we had 379 cases over a period of 24 hours. Almost 300 of them are in Lombardy even today. Now, what they're trying to figure out is if the government locked down the various villages and hamlets soon enough, and whether or not that was actually the issue of the government to do, or if that should have been the local Lombardy regional government, which is of course run by the far right party there. There's really no way they can charge the government for the epidemic or the pandemic, but there's a precedent in this particular case, because if you look at the earthquake in L'Aquila in 2009, 6 scientists were found guilty eventually of not predicting the earthquake. There's a precedent here to file these sorts of lawsuits, to try to open these sorts of investigations. And that's, generally speaking, the only way families have access to the files and the documents. And that's one of the reasons they're doing this. They're not looking for criminal culpability. They're not looking for money. They want to know who's responsible for this getting out of hand so quickly and so drastically in Lombardy.
Dave Clark, this issue of pointing blame, we already saw it as well from the UK with that study out of Imperial College London that says if lockdown had started a week sooner, 20,000 lives could have been saved. Are we headed for a long blame game all around?
Yes, and I've been struck that a lot of people across Europe seem to think that their government has done the worst. Presumably, only one of the governments can be the worst. But people have reacted against their own governments in many cases. In the first few weeks of the outbreak, there was a kind of national solidarity. And then as these things have continued, the blame game has begun. And there have been shifting poll numbers. Obviously, French presidents often have low approval ratings. The French seem very grumpy with their leaders the best of times. But this is now true also of Boris Johnson, who won a very big election victory just towards the end of last year, and is now trailing the opposition leader, Keir Starmer, in some approval polls. Obviously, he was hit by the scandal over his chief advisor apparently breaking lockdown rules and traveling to my part of the world, to northeast England, spreading the virus in his wake, no doubt. But it's been interesting with all my British friends saying that their government has done the worst, and other French people are saying, no, our government is terrible. Obviously, the numbers were very bad in Italy and in Spain. Sweden has had a lot of deaths given the size of its population. Belgium has had per capita a terrible experience and a caretaker government that won't survive much beyond the summer. I suppose from the scientific point of view, we won't know for months or years who really did the best job. But it's interesting that everyone seems most keen to blame their local leaders.
Most keen to blame their local leaders. And we're also going to get a better glimpse over whether or not they were right to deconfine, as the French say, to ease lockdown, when on Monday we have a lot of countries on this continent which will be reopening borders, those that haven't. It was interesting to hear, you can see the map there, that some of them will be opening around this time. I know where, Johanna Frenden, where you are in Spain, it's July the 1st, although in some of the resort areas that's sooner. When it was interesting to hear the Finnish announce that they were reopening their borders. They had a long list of countries where citizens were welcome. Of course, that long list of countries, Johanna, excluded one. You can guess which it is. Sweden, which never imposed a lockdown. And whereas Dave Clark says the death rate was higher, let's listen to the health minister.
It is true that the Swedish rates of mortality are comparatively high on certain days or weeks. However, it's also true that these kinds of comparisons tends to be a snapshot of the pandemic on a certain period of time. And this
portrayal, or is that a little bit too much positive spin there, Johanna Frenden?
Well, it's the kind of positive spin that a lot of the Swedes accepted in the beginning. Everybody was seeing that Sweden was doing a lot worse compared to the neighboring countries, perhaps not worse than France or Spain or Italy or Belgium for that matter, but with comparable neighbors, clearly. And it took some time before the an actual wave of critique came, against the government and against the health authorities, who do have a lot of authority in this question and a lot of power in Sweden. Now, it's complicated and it's hard to debate scientific issues, of course, because we can also see in Sweden that the Stockholm region is very hard hit, a bit like Lombardy in Italy, whereas Gothenburg or Malmö in the south of the country, which is, a dense population, lots of immigration close to what we call the continent, Denmark and so on, has not been hit almost at all. So there are still lots of things that we don't understand. It's also been stated this week, in fact, that Sweden had people coming in from 10 or 15 different countries being contaminated already, all the way from Wuhan to Italy, France, I think South America as well, and Iran, where we have a big immigration population. And this never happened in Finland or in Norway. So there are lots of ways of explaining this. However, what can you do about the numbers? How can you explain, to the Swedes that it's natural that we have 10 times as many deaths as Norway, who is not only a very good neighbor, but also our constant rival, in any political matter. So yes, the Swedes are anxious to get the numbers down, and it has, perhaps a bit surprisingly, not yet really affected the trust in the government. The figures are quite high still, and I'm really curious to see what happens in the next 2 or 3 weeks. I think we will see perhaps a change of mind in the Swedes in this matter.
Borzo Dargahi, trust in public authorities in Sweden still high. You heard what Johanna Friend had said. Your reaction to that?
It's not shocking. I think that if you look at this pandemic and how governments that dealt with it, there's a whole variety of reactions in terms of how governments dealt with it and whether it inspired confidence and so on. I think at the bottom of the scale, you have these opaque or wannabe opaque authoritarians like, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump, United States, Putin, and so on. And these guys mishandled it, and it hurt them. It hurt their popularity, it hurt their countries, it hurt their economies, and so on. And then you have countries that are more transparent and democratic and handled it well, and those countries saw a big boost. Countries like New Zealand or Iceland and a few other countries in the West. And then you have countries that are democratic and transparent and handled it poorly, like maybe France and the UK and so on. And even those leaders saw a boost. So I think that Sweden falls into that category of democratic, transparent countries that handled it poorly, mediocrely. Yet, because they had an open societal debate, because there was no secrecy, because the numbers weren't botched or fudged, people were understanding, and people are understanding. And Macron had a bump. It's extraordinary given the numbers in France.
That bump is gone. Don't worry, Borzo. He's going to be speaking on television on Sunday evening, but I think the bump is gone for now. Let me ask you, how's Turkey doing?
I mean, Turkey is an authoritarian-esque country that handled it well. Numbers are down. They very early on, as soon as there was a case, they shut down schools, they shut down everything. The shutdown became more and more and more and more severe until the curve really flattened. Right now, we have about 19 deaths a day across the country due to COVID-19. I think there's probably fewer people who die of car accidents in Istanbul. And that's down from a peak of like 140 per day. And there's, new cases are about 900, 1,000 a day. This is a country of 83 million. The hospitals are good. And so this is a country that experienced the bump. Even people who are big critics of the government of Recep Tayyip Erdogan are like, I have to hand it to him. they did a pretty decent job here.
They did a pretty decent job of that, and yet at the same time, we're reading reports about flagging popularity or a spike again in arrests of political opponents and journalists. Is there a COVID effect when it comes to that?
I'm not sure. I think that's a good one. I think that a lot of governments, it's very American to say, but if you get lemons, make lemonade. We've got a economic slowdown. We've got a pandemic that is destroying all of our ambitions for one thing, but hey, maybe we can use this pandemic to do a few other goals that we've had in mind, such as, in the United States, imposing immigration restrictions, and in Turkey, putting more pressure on opposition figures. These are things that are long-standing items on leaders' wish lists, and now they get to do them because they can't do the other ambitious things that they wanted to do.
All right, one ambitious thing that Europeans are doing is resuming their football season in most places, not here in France, but as you said at the outset, Johanna Frenden, that's what brings you to Barcelona. And we can show images there of the Seville derby seen from a bar because, well, most fans were not able to get anywhere near the stadium when the first match kicked off Thursday between Sevilla and Betis. What's the atmosphere like?
It's very anticipated. I think the first couple of months of the pandemic, when football was shut down everywhere, and France took the decision to stop the season and hand the title to PSG. There was a lot of reluctancy around this question. Lots of footballers saying, "I don't want to take this risk. I don't want to play. My wife is risk group. How do I quarantine?" Lots of questions, but in fact, you can see that there are very few cases reported since the Bundesliga started again, which was obviously the first football league to take off a few weeks ago. Also, the Premier League has done quite well so far. They're about to kick off. And the Spanish squads seem to have survived in the sense that there haven't been many cases reported either. You have to know that the players are tested twice a week, and there are lots of measurements around, especially when they arrive to the stadium. Gloves, face masks, spending only 20 minutes in the dressing room. The starting 11 changing at one spot, the substitutors at another one. It's worked. The protocol has worked. I think that's what you can take away from it. Now, people are happy to have football back, of course. Really eager to see, who will win between Barcelona and Real Madrid because they both play this weekend. But there is no people in the stands. It's a different kind of sport. It's the second best, of course, but it's people will have to sit in bars and think about the social distancing, and that's hard when you're fired up because your own team scores a goal, wins a good game. So the football public is confronted with a lot of new situations and challenges, I think, in this situation.
Dave Clark, this week it's Spain, next week it's England. On the 17th, games resume there. Was it the right decision to resume the season? Couldn't they just wait until August?
Well, we were waiting until Newcastle United's injury list shrank, and a lot of our players seem to have recovered in this unusual mid-season break. So we're looking forward to facing Sheffield on the 21st at St James's Park. Culturally, something may have changed, though. I was looking forward to the next season here in Brussels. I follow Union Saint-Gilloise here, and Molenbeek has been promoted, so we're going to have a local derby match. And last season, I spent a lot of time in a crowd of people. But last night, I was back in a Belgian pub for the first time since the lockdown started. Things have begun to ease here. And it did feel odd being in the crowd. And I wonder whether our societies have changed. Will I feel comfortable in a football crowd? Would I feel comfortable taking my boy to the match when the season does restart here in Belgium with crowds? Obviously, there may be some games beforehand without crowds. Have things changed, or when this epidemic is over, do things just resume as per normal?
Barbie Lazzanato, what have the tifosi in Italy, the fans there, been telling you?
Well, I mean, it is really thought to be a human right here to be able to watch football. It's been a painful experience to not have their fans. But you see people gathering increasingly together in parks. It's like I saw the other day, people who had brought a TV down, extension cords down all the floors of the apartment building next door to try to watch kind of old football, just to be together. They were socially distanced. The police are very, very strict here about keeping people socially distanced. You still can't have crowds of people in your house and things like that. But it just felt so desperate and so important to gather together. It's one thing to watch football in the privacy of your own home, but these were people who just wanted to be around each other, watching a match that they knew the outcome of, but it was sort of wonderful and tragic all at the same time. But I think they're really ready for it. What we're really seeing as well here are the kids out there playing, and it's very much part of the culture here to be playing soccer in the piazza, to play football in the piazza. And you see that with more and more and more frequency here. So that feels like things are getting back to normal. But it won't be normal until the stadiums are full here. And I think that the Italians will risk it. I think they're very, very ready to get back together and watch crowded stadiums, to be watching together and cheering together and losing together and winning together. I cannot see that they'll, be satisfied until everything is truly back to normal in that sense, which should be this fall, they tell us.
All right. Before we go, and we'll see whether or not that prediction holds true, a couple of stories that may have been overlooked because it's been such a busy week. One of them is Libya, where we're wondering, is it a turning point? Borzu Daragahi, I know you've covered the conflict there often since the toppling of Muammar Gaddafi. And what we had seen a year ago was this offensive from the east by nationalist leader Khalifa Haftar. And now, with Turkish support, the UN-recognized government on the counteroffensive. Is it a turning point?
It is a turning point. It is a major development to have this happen on a number of levels. You have Turkey, just every single day, there's people who are trackers, and they track flights, bringing loads and loads of military equipment into Libya. Are they setting up a semi-permanent or even permanent base at the south of Europe in the northern Africa? I mean, that's a really interesting question. You have the Russians that also appear to be gaining a foothold in Libya with an air base there, and you have this big political turnaround. What it is, and
on that score, it's Turkey 1, Russia 0, since the Russians support the side that's on the back foot right now.
It's actually more like Turkey 7, Russia 3, and Europe, since this is a France 24-0 at this point, with France betting big on Haftar and losing big, and Europe increasingly becoming marginalized. I speak to Western diplomats in Brussels who are telling me with alarm that they fear that what they call it the Syrianization of Libya, where Turkey and Russia divvy up the spoils of the country, become the key diplomatic players, and Europe becomes an irrelevancy. And that is really the issue right now. Russia and Turkey negotiating over the future of a major country at the southern belly of Europe with oil reserves, a gateway to Africa, and Europe being left out in the cold.
Barbie Lazzanato, it's a former Italian colony we're talking about, Italy, which has lots of interest there as well. Are people paying attention?
Oh, absolutely. It's an issue. Anything that's going wrong in Libya ultimately becomes Italy's problem because of the migrants that come across and refugees that come across the sea. Now, we've seen an increase in that as there's fighting in Libya. You see some of these detention centers blown open, and you've got boats coming. We've had boats coming across without rescue ships arriving all the way to Sicily and Lampedusa over the course of the last couple of weeks, like we haven't seen, for 10 years. And you can always tell when the fighting is picking up in Libya, and that those detention centers are the first to kind of be the collateral damage of that. And it's always going to be an Italian problem what happens in Libya, also because of the oil interests that the Italians have there, the infrastructure interests, all of that came from Silvio Berlusconi. Everybody's watching what's happening in Libya here, also because we're seeing it firsthand.
And also, before we go, From Sweden, a cold case from 34 years ago, closed for now. Prime Minister Olof Palme was murdered on the street. His assassin was never found. Police this week had promised big revelations. They say they were putting it to bed for now. The main suspect who committed suicide in 2006.
Huruvida förundersökningen kan öppnas igen. Så det är ju väldigt svårt att svara på, men kommer det fram sådana omständigheter som tyder på att man skulle kunna komma fram till en lösning på mordet.
So in other words, Johanna Frunden, case closed until it's reopened?
It's not really that simple. That's obviously what the police wanted, and that's what all the Swedes wanted as well. I mean, one of my first memories in life is, in fact, the murder of Olof Palme. Anybody in my generation will remember, the parents in front of the TV, mothers crying, especially because this was such an unlikely thing to happen in Sweden. Now, the solution, or the suspect, the main suspect that was presented this week, is not satisfactory enough for lots of Swedish people. The debate is, just reignited, basically. Who did really do this, and who was then behind this man? Is the police involved? Was it South Africa? Could it have been the Kurds? Lots of old ideas that sort of resurfaced. This is unfortunately not the end for the Swedes in general. Very few people will be able to put this story, as you said, to bed and just believe it was this simple, or whatever you would call it. It's an ongoing trauma, and it will last for probably another 30 years at least.
A bit like the JFK assassination in the US. Johanna Frunden, I want to thank you so much for joining us today from Barcelona. Borzu Daragahi in Istanbul, Barbie Latza Nadeau in Rome, Dave Clark in Brussels. Thank you for joining us here in ever greater numbers on Facebook, on Twitter as well, and on our YouTube channel. Bye for now from the world this week.